To begin our program, I'll help you select the best warm weather vegetables for your particular garden. Next, I'll show you that it's easy and handy to grow your own healthy vegetable seedlings for the summer garden. Then, I'll show you that vertical growing techniques can significantly increase the productivity of your garden without taking up any extra space. Next, you'll learn that using organic mulch on the summer garden saves water while improving the growth of plants by cooling the soil. In this segment, I'll show you how to water the summer garden while saving time, saving water, and reducing disease. In feeding the summer garden, I'll show you that it can all be done with a main meal, some snacks, and maybe even some vitamins. Next, I'll show you the latest techniques for controlling insect pests and disease so they don't spoil your summer produce. And finally, I'll give you some tips on the most important part of that summer garden: how to harvest the final product. In this yardening series, I make a distinction between cool weather vegetables and warm weather vegetables. And I have separate programs describing the techniques for raising each group. By warm weather vegetables, I mean those plants that are vulnerable to the frost and don't generally go out into the garden until about 2 or 3 weeks until after the last frost in the spring. Cool weather vegetables like peas and spinach and broccoli and cabbage, they'll make up your spring crop and your fall crop. But the warm weather vegetables, tomatoes, green beans, peppers, cucumbers, and eggplants, they'll provide the main crop throughout the entire summer and will generally be finished up by that first frost in the fall. Now, the techniques for keeping warm weather vegetables healthy are somewhat different than those for cool weather vegetables. So let's take a look. Let's take a minute to talk about which warm weather crops we're going to include in our garden this year. One of the most common mistakes made by beginning gardeners is to include too many different kinds of vegetables in that first garden. It's easy to get carried away going through a seed catalog in snowy January. One secret to success is to plant only those vegetables that you like to eat. So make a list of those warm weather crops that your family particularly likes, and then just include those in that first year. Now, one guideline is to use roughly twice as many crops in the summer garden as you had in your early spring garden. But in any case, a beginning gardener probably should not have any more than 10 warm weather crops in that first garden. Some of the favorite warm weather crops include tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, green beans, and corn, all of which require warmer temperatures to thrive. One trick is to try to plan the timing of your warm weather crops so that they grow and are harvested in between growing your spring crops and your fall crops, giving you maximum productivity from that limited space in your garden. There are some real benefits to using seedlings in your garden as much as you possibly can. There are some warm weather vegetables like beans that need to be direct seeded into the soil. But if you can use a seedling, you can sometimes replace a cool weather crop like cabbage with a good sized warm weather crop like cucumber and get 2 harvests out of the same spot in 1 year. That's called succession planting. Now, you can buy your seedlings from the local nursery. It's going to save you some time, but it's also going to cost you some money. But I suggest you give serious consideration to growing your own seedlings. If you grow your own, you're going to have seedlings when you need them, not when the garden center decides to stock them. you're going to have much more variety to choose from because most garden centers offer only 2 or 3 varieties for most plants. And finally, in the long run, it's going to be cheaper. The main issue in selecting a container for raising seedlings is to have enough room for the roots. The 2 concerns are to make sure that the plant doesn't get root bound before you transplant it, as this one has, and also to try to reduce, if not eliminate, the root loss when you transplant that seedling out into the garden. Here we have a number of different kinds of containers. Individual containers, flats for holding containers, what are called peat pots, and here's one with a cover on it designed to sit in a windowsill. Now the critical variables are making sure you have an individual container for each seedling, making sure it's at least 2 inches tall, and having a hole in the bottom for good drainage. Now let's talk about the soil mix that goes inside these containers. The ideal seedling mix is quick draining, has lots of room for air and oxygen, and has good capacity to retain moisture. It's that combination of being quick draining and being able to retain moisture that's critical. Now, if you're a beginning gardener, I suggest you use no soil from the outside garden in any seedling mix. The chances of bringing in some disease problems are far too great. So you can use what's called a soilless mix. It has no dirt or soil in it whatsoever. Comes ready mixed from the nursery, and it looks something like this. Or if you choose, you can make your own seedling mix. A simple recipe is 1 part vermiculite, 1 part perlite, and 1 part either sphagnum moss or commercial potting soil. No matter which mix you use, make sure that it's well moistened before you put it into the container. Now there's another way to raise seedlings using no container at all. It's my favorite way. You can use what's called a peat pellet or a soil block to raise your seedlings. The advantage of these devices is that when you put that plant out into the garden, there's hardly any transplant shock at all. And if the plant doesn't have to recover, it can just keep right on growing. Now you can get the pellets commercially. They look a lot like a checker for a checkerboard. And when you soak them in water, they expand into a little net bag. There's a hole in the top for the seed. Here's a little seedling popping out right there. Now they're real simple to use, but if you use a whole lot, they tend to be a bit expensive. Now, a less expensive way of doing the same job is to make your own soil block. You can use that recipe I just gave you for a seedling mix and use this tool, which you can buy from a mail-order catalog. After you get the hang of it, you can make 2 or 3 dozen of these blocks in just 3 or 4 minutes. For starting seedlings, they really do the job. The rule of thumb with warm weather vegetables is to start your seedlings about 6 to 8 weeks before those plants are safe to be put outside into the garden. Check a good gardening book or the back of the seed packet for that set-out date. Most seeds will germinate best at a soil temperature of about 70 degrees. So you want to put your container someplace in your house where you have that temperature around there at least during the day. The top of the refrigerator is always a good place. Now, once those seedlings have emerged, you must never, ever let them dry out. So if you don't have a container like this that comes with its own cover, you can use a trick using a plastic bag from the cleaners. Simply put your container inside the plastic bag, and that'll hold the moisture in. Now, tomatoes are one of those plants which like to be transplanted a couple of times before it goes out into the garden. Now, you'll transplant tomatoes first when it shows its first true leaves. We want to hold the seedling by the leaves, not by the stem, and then very carefully prick it out and put it in the larger pot. Now, we can plant this a little more deeply than it was in the original container. Tomatoes are one of the few plants that when you put the stem down below the level of the soil, more roots will pop out of that stem. So if you take your tomatoes and transplant them 2, maybe 3 times into bigger pots before you put them outside, they're going to have a real strong root system when they do get outside. Now you can start seedlings just fine on a sunny window, but they'll even be better if you grow them under a fluorescent light system. You can use a rig that looks like this. You can make it yourself or you can buy it commercially. When you're growing plants under lights, keep those bulbs about 2 to 4 inches above the top of the leaves at all times. Run your lights about 14 to 16 hours a day, and you'll have some of the strongest, stockiest seedlings you've ever had. I think too many gardeners overlook vertical growing techniques. And I think the reason is that setting up a trellis or rigging a TP or putting a pole in the soil every season can be a real problem for many gardeners. And even more frustrating, those poles can fall over. At the same time, if you raise some of your vegetables vertically, you can save an enormous amount of space that can be used for plants that can't grow on a trellis, like eggplants and carrots and celery. A garden with a good trellis system can increase productivity by 30% and not take up much more space. Now, there's some other advantages to vertical growing as well. Your vegetables stay cleaner, they don't get soil rot from lying on the ground, the leaves of the plant are more exposed to the sun, therefore the plant grows better, the plant's going to drain faster after a rain, reducing disease problems, and vegetables growing on a trellis are much easier to pick. You can use any number of rigs to raise vegetables vertically, but there's one problem with many designs, such as this A-frame for my pole beans, or these cages for the tomatoes. And that one problem is that the device itself takes up growing space in my garden. Now, I'm raising a lot of beans here, all right, but I'm growing nothing in the middle of that bed. A better approach, it seems to me, is to rig your trellis along the edge of the bed, taking up the least amount of growing area. Now, I rig my trellises using these foundation devices attached to the inside of the boxed raised bed. The foundation is made of rigid PVC pipe, 1.5 inches in diameter, cut to 12-inch lengths, attached to the inside of the bed with some kind of brackets, and spaced every 4 feet along the length of both sides of the bed. My poles are made of rigid PVC pipe, 1 inch in diameter, cut to 7 or 8 foot lengths. They fit nicely right inside that foundation like so. Now, you want to be sure that you get a pipe that's strong enough. So you look at the label for the schedule number. You're looking for at least a 40. This pipe will be strong enough to hold the heaviest load of tomatoes or even melons, and still light enough to be easy to handle. Now, I drill holes in the top and the bottom of each of these pipes so I can mount some panels on them. These net panels are made up of nylon netting attached to 2 pieces of 1 by 2 inch furring strip cut at 5 foot lengths. The netting is attached to the furring strips with a staple gun. I attach the panels to my poles with stove bolts and butterfly nuts. This makes for easy installation and later removal. Now, I've cut this netting so when I attach the bottom of the panel, that netting is going to be nice and tight. Makes the trellis look nicer, and also it helps the vegetables attach themselves more easily. Notice that my netting is about 4 or 5 inches across. That allows me to pick vegetables both on the inside of the trellis and on the outside. Now, this nylon netting is going to last at least 5 or 6 years. And once you build one of these systems for one bed, you can rig it again in about 20 minutes. Simple mathematics says that when you rig a trellis at 7 foot tall, along the length of a bed that's 24 feet long, you're going to add to that 100 square feet another 175 square feet of growing area. When you have a single bed that offers 275 feet of area, you're making very efficient use of your garden space. Now that we've built this nice trellis system, what kind of warm weather vegetables can we grow on this rig? Pole beans make good candidates. Compared to a bush bean, pole beans taste just as good and freeze just as well. And while bush beans produce food for only 2 or 3 weeks, pole beans produce food all season long. In fact, a pole bean will produce 2 to 3 times as much food per square foot as a bush bean grown in the same area. You can raise snap beans, either the green or the yellow type, or you can raise lima beans, just fine on a trellis system. And of course, tomatoes do very well on a trellis. Now there's 2 kinds of tomato plants. So there's determinate varieties of tomatoes and there's indeterminate varieties of tomatoes. Determinate varieties of tomatoes seldom grow taller than 2 or 3 feet, but they like to have support. The indeterminate varieties can grow as long as 20 feet if you let them. Now when you plant tomatoes on a trellis system, you can put them 12 to 15 inches apart instead of the normal 24 inches. Now tomatoes don't attach themselves to the trellis, so you're going to have to give them some help. So when they're young, you want to use some rags or some twistums and attach them to the netting. Remember to keep these tie-ups very loose because you don't want to restrict the growth of the plant. Then, when the plant gets to be about 2 or 3 feet high, you can start weaving the plant in the mesh of the netting. After a while, the netting will support the weight of the plant rather than those tie-ups. Now, determinate tomatoes don't need to have any pruning, but the indeterminate tomatoes must be pruned. When we talk about pruning, we're talking about getting rid of the suckers. Suckers will grow between the main stem of the plant and the side shoot. Whenever you see a sucker, it's got to go. If you were to let all those suckers grow and not do any pruning, you'd have a big bushy plant all right, but all the energy of the plant is going to go to shoots and leaves and not to producing fruit. Then when the plant gets up to about 7 feet tall at the top of the trellis, I cut that main stem right off. And what that does is force the plant to put all of its energy into producing fruit. Then about 5 or 6 weeks before the expected first frost in the fall, I go around and I cut off all the growing shoots on the plant. Then what I'm going to do is take off all the blossoms. What that does in the shorter days of fall is to force the plant to put all of its energy into ripening just that fruit that's been set. Then about 2 weeks before that first frost, I'm going to cover the entire trellis and the plants with this fleece material. You can buy it from mail order catalogs. And what it does is protect the plant from those first 2 or 3 light frosts. This can give you maybe 2 or 3 more weeks of fresh tomatoes. Now, vertical crops like cucumbers, melons, and squash don't need to have any supports because they can climb right up that netting all by themselves using these tendrils to hold on to the netting. The only other consideration for things like melons and squash is that the fruit needs to have some kind of support so it doesn't fall down on the ground when it starts to ripen. So you need to rig some kind of a sling. Use a netting material like this. What you want to do is rig the sling about the time the fruit's the size of a softball, and rig it so you take the weight of the fruit off the stem. Then with that sling, the fruit will ripen just fine. So as you can see, when you start rigging a trellis system, that's when you start increasing the productivity of your garden. I see lots of vegetable gardens simmering under that hot August sun and not one shred of mulch protecting those gasping plants. I think mulch is one of the most important tools in your garden. Doesn't take much time or money and does a lot of good things for your warm weather vegetables. First of all, mulch is going to reduce the evaporation of moisture from your soil. That's going to save you water and save you time in watering. In addition to that, it's going to reduce, if not eliminate, those weeds in your garden, saving more time. It's also going to reduce compaction problems. But probably the most important thing mulch does for you in the summertime is cool the soil. You can actually control the soil temperature by the mulch that you use, and that has a lot to do with how well your vegetables grow, especially in the high heat of the summer. Now, in another program on cool weather vegetables, we talked about using this black plastic mulch to warm the temperature of that soil so we can get a jump on the growing season. But come May or June, we don't want to heat that soil. For during the summer, we want to cool it. Now, a lot of vegetables, especially corn, really don't like it when the temperature around their roots hits 85 degrees. They literally stop growing. They don't die, they just sort of sit there. So the trick then is we want to find a way to get that soil temperature either down to or below 80 degrees, and that way we can keep our vegetables growing all summer long. So the best way to cool that soil is to use some form of organic mulch. Something like straw or hay or chopped leaves. So the first thing we want to do is to keep track of our soil temperature. We do that with a soil thermometer. When that temperature begins to average somewhere between 70 and 75 degrees, then it's time to put 4 to 6 inches of organic mulch over the entire garden. Now, 4 to 6 inches of straw is going to reduce your soil temperatures anywhere from 8 to 12 degrees. 4 to 6 inches of chopped leaves could reduce your temperatures down as much as 18 degrees. Be sure you use chopped leaves, though, because if you use whole leaves as a mulch, they're going to tend to mat and prevent the even distribution of water down into the soil. By the way, another trick to cool your soil is to turn on your drip irrigation system somewhere after lunch instead of early in the morning. That way you'll be cooling the soil while you're watering the soil. Now, it's not really necessary, but it is helpful to have black plastic on there before we put the organic mulch on top. Reason for that is that the bottom layer of that organic mulch is going to begin to decompose over the season. And that pulls a little bit of nitrogen out of that top inch or two of your soil, and you'd rather have that for your plants. So having that black plastic in there eliminates the problem. I know there are some folks who live in slug country who sometimes hesitate to use mulch because they're afraid that it harbors those slugs during the day underneath that first level of mulch. And there's some truth to that, but you can control slugs, as we'll talk about in a minute. And as far as I'm concerned, the benefits of mulch far outweigh the liability of some slugs, especially if you can control them. But if you do have slugs, one of the tricks is to remember that slugs are most active when the air temperature is between 60 and 70 degrees. So what you do is you wait until that average air temperature is over 70, probably in July, then put on your mulch, have your mulch on over the hot summer when the slugs are inactive, and then when that average temperature gets down to 70 again, off comes the organic mulch. You sort of get the best of both worlds. Whether you have slugs or not, you're going to want to take this organic mulch off of your garden sometime in September when the fall comes, and let that plastic mulch start doing its warming thing again. And that'll give an extra kick to those tomatoes and peppers and eggplants as they move into the cool season. So you're going to use plastic mulch in the spring, organic mulch in the summer, plastic mulch again in the fall. It's a good mulching system. There are two ways to water a vegetable garden. You can give each vegetable, the corn, the tomatoes, the peppers, what they individually need, and that's going to give you maximum production. You might even win a prize at the county fair, but it's going to take a lot more time. The other way, the way I prefer, is to treat the whole garden uniformly. Now, a lot of people are going to underwater their vegetables, but the most serious cause of stress to a vegetable plant is the fluctuation in moisture between very wet, very dry, very wet again. So we want to avoid that fluctuation, so the first rule is going to be consistent. Now, all vegetables need at least 1 inch of water a week. If you live in a dry or hot area, 2 inches of water. If you don't use organic mulch like this straw, then you're going to have to add even more water to compensate for the loss to evaporation. So the first tool we're going to use in watering our vegetable garden is going to be a rain gauge. Keep track of our weekly rainfall. I want to make sure that's straight. Now, what happens when we get 1 inch of rain? Well, 1 inch is going to give us a half a gallon of water on every square foot of the garden. That means in a 100 square foot bed like this, I need 50 gallons of water a week if it doesn't rain. Now, I don't want to give my vegetables their whole 1 inch at one time, so I suggest you water your garden 2 or 3 times a week to avoid that fluctuation problem. Now, one of the tricks when you're watering from overhead is to put a can of some sort in the middle of your bed so that whether you're using an overhead sprinkler or a hose like this, you can keep track of how much water you've been giving your vegetables. Now when that can gets a ½ inch of water, that's enough for today. At the end of the week, you've given the garden 1.5 inches of water. That's 1 inch for the vegetables and ½ inch for evaporation and runoff. One other point, don't use an overhead device at night or in the evening, because that's just going to leave water on the leaves overnight, and that's asking for disease problems. Now, overhead watering will do the job, but for a vegetable garden, I really prefer what's called a drip irrigation system. First of all, it saves all kinds of water, about 30 to 50% compared to an overhead type. Saves all kinds of time, and research has shown that plants that have been raised with a drip irrigation system watered regularly have 20 to 30% more productivity than plants watered with an overhead system regularly. Also, drip system reduces compaction problems, it cools the soil, maybe most important, reduces disease problems because there's no water getting on the leaves. Now this type of system is called a porous hose. It's made out of chopped up, recycled automobile tires. It's got millions and millions of little pores letting water into the ground very, very slowly along its entire length. Another type of system is called an emitter system. And about every 15 or 20 inches along the line are these little valves called emitters. And they let water into the soil very slowly, just a drop at a time. And you can get these systems in kits like this. It's a good way to start. Now, when you let your lines out, you want to make sure, whether it's a porous system or an emitter system, that they're no more than 2 feet apart, maybe even a little closer, because they're going to water the plants about 12 inches on either side of the line. Of course, we're going to cover it up with mulch to keep the evaporation down. And once the lines are laid, all we have to do is attach it to the end of our garden hose. And I like to use one of these mechanical timers. All you have to do is turn it on and it turns itself off. Let me show you. Look at that. Puts water very slowly into the ground. And that's a beautiful system because all you have to do is turn it on, and I'm watering my vegetable garden while I'm watching the ball game. I'll run my drip lines 2, usually 3 times a week. Run them for 20, 30 minutes at a shot. And that gives me my 1 inch of water for the week. If I get more than ½ inch of rain, I'll let it go for 2 or 3 days and then start the cycle all over again. For those of you who want to worry about the individual watering needs for each type of vegetable, first thing you need is a reliable gardening book. Find a chart on watering requirements. And where you have medium requirements, like with corn or peppers, that 1 inch a week does the job. But things like tomatoes and cucumbers like heavy watering, so you may want to add some for them. Now, tomatoes are one of the vegetables that are real vulnerable to that fluctuation problem I talked about. If you get blossom end rot or cracking of your tomatoes when they ripen, the chances are real good that you had inconsistent watering at some point through the season. So you want to be careful of that. Now, whenever I put transplants and seedlings into my garden, I want to supplement the drip system with some hand watering for at least a week, maybe 2, to make sure those roots get a chance to get over close to the drip lines. So use a drip system, put a timer in there, be consistent with your watering, and you shouldn't have any watering problems at all. There are 2 different approaches to feeding your plants in the vegetable garden. One way is to fertilize each vegetable according to its own feeding preference or need. Green beans are considered light feeders. Tomatoes are heavy feeders. That means you're going to give more fertilizer to the tomatoes than you are to the green beans. So if you're looking for absolute maximum productivity from your vegetable, every vegetable in the garden, then you're going to have to treat each vegetable according to its needs. On the other hand, if, like me, you're sometimes short of time and you're willing to accept just average productivity, then I think you can treat the whole garden pretty much the same way. Still get lots of fresh vegetables and save a little time. Now, technology and research have had tremendous impact on the techniques for feeding a vegetable garden. You can pretty much boil it down to 3 simple steps, and 2 of those are optional. The required feeding step is to lay out enough slow-acting fertilizer in the spring to last for the entire year. sort of like giving the garden its main meal. Then during the growing season, if you choose, you can supplement that main meal with some snacks, sort of like an energy boost. And also, if you choose, you can offer your plants a form of vitamin at various times during the growing season to help them grow a little better. First, let's talk about that main meal. In my program on designing and building a vegetable garden, I showed you how I put a full inch of compost over the entire surface of the garden in the spring. That's a good source of nitrogen, and this has tremendous water holding capacities. Then every couple of years, I added a dusting of rock powders. Use rock phosphate for phosphorus, green sand for potassium. And these amendments are all that I need in terms of the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potassium to meet all the nutrient needs of every vegetable in my garden for the entire year and still give me good production. You can do the same thing with a commercial fertilizer. You can buy an organic fertilizer that uses some form of dried manure or plant waste material as the nitrogen source. Or you can use what's called a synthetic chemical fertilizer. Make sure, though, that you get the kind that has the slow-release form of nitrogen. That'll feed your plants very slowly throughout the season. A fertilizer with a slow-release form of nitrogen is not going to burn the roots of the plants, and it's not going to repel your earthworms. Remember, those earthworms are going to give you many pounds of free fertilizer themselves. Generally, you would spread from 1 to 3 pounds of dry, slow-acting fertilizer on every 100 square feet of your garden. So whether you use a homemade compost or a commercial type of slow-release fertilizer, one application of the right type of fertilizer in the spring gives your vegetable garden its full year's supply of nutrients. So while it's not absolutely necessary, I like to supplement that main food supply with some snacks for my plants during the growing season. That's going to give my vegetables an extra energy boost when they're producing fruit and also maybe experiencing some stress from the heat of the summer. For giving snacks, I prefer liquid fertilizer. Plants take up nutrients 20 to 30 times faster in liquid form than in powdered form. This is true whether the liquid is applied to the roots in the soil or whether it's sprayed on the plant foliage as a foliar spray. Foliar feeding involves spraying diluted liquid fertilizer directly onto the leaves or the foliage of the plants using a spraying device that can produce a mist-like spray. With this relatively new technique, you can give your entire garden a quick snack in just a few minutes. Besides being faster, foliar feeding is superior to feeding through the soil because there's absolutely no waste of fertilizer. The plant gets it all. There are no firm rules for the frequency of giving snacks to your vegetables. Some gardeners will give their plants just a very dilute solution of liquid fertilizer every single time they water. I like to give snacks somewhere between every 2 to 4 weeks. Best time to spray is in the morning. That gives the plants all day to pick up those nutrients. In fact, you should never spray in the evening. It leaves water on those leaves overnight, and that's just asking for disease. How about some vitamins for your vegetables? There are a number of seaweed or kelp extracts that have been used by commercial agriculture for a number of years as a foliar spray for plants. And what's happened is these products have caused enormous increase both in plant growth and plant productivity, including more and larger vegetables, lusher foliage, and better disease resistance. What research has shown is that these extracts aren't operating just as a fertilizer, although they do have some food value. Somehow they're becoming a catalyst or an enhancer that causes the plant to more effectively absorb nutrients from the soil. This sort of works like a vitamin does with us. It doesn't replace a good diet. It supplements that diet and makes it work better. Research indicates that just 2 or 3 applications of very dilute liquid seaweed extract applied as a foliar spray will improve plant growth, increase its capacity to withstand drought, and it's going to reduce the incidence of disease. Seaweed extract in liquid form loses some of its catalyst value after about a year, so you want to have a fresh bottle every year. On the other hand, the dry, water-soluble stuff is good for about 5 years. And now they're coming out with a liquid fertilizer mixed with plant enhancer right in the same bottle. That lets you do two jobs at the same time. Most of these products are available through mail-order catalogs. So if you give your garden that main meal, that slow-reacting fertilizer in the spring, and then every month or so give them a snack, and maybe even give them a vitamin or two, you're going to have the fertilizing task under control. Insects, disease, and pests can be a problem in a vegetable garden, but they don't have to be. In a healthy vegetable garden, you're going to have both bad guys and good guys living here all the time in some sort of balance. The pests are going to be controlled by the predators or the good guys almost all the time. It's when the balance breaks down that you have a problem. So I suggest you consider using what I call a backyard pest management program to control those pests in the garden. BPM, as we'll call it, in the home garden uses the strategy that tries to control pest problems rather than trying to completely eradicate or exterminate them. It focuses on techniques that are designed to do everything we can to try to prevent the problems from occurring in the first place. Then, if a problem does occur, we take only the steps necessary to attack that one problem. It's quite a different approach to the more traditional means of pest control. BPM uses 4 broad steps to control pests: creating as healthy an environment for the plants as you can, then establishing some ability to monitor problems as they arise, next identifying your particular pest problem that does show up, and finally using control measures designed to deal with just those particular problems in your garden. First, a healthy environment for your plants. There are 2 steps. Step 1, always maintain good garden hygiene. By good hygiene, I mean minimizing every single possibility that there is in the garden for insects or disease to breed and multiply. That means no piles of rotting weeds or refuse any place in the garden. That may seem simple, but look around your garden. You might find a few piles just here and there. Step number 2. You need to maintain good, healthy soil. It turns out that insect pests almost always will first attack plants that are weakened for some reason, either from poor soil conditions, improper feeding, or improper watering. Now, since good, healthy soil generally produces healthy plants, those healthy plants become kind of an insect repellent all by themselves. They also have better disease resistance. Those 2 steps alone will go a long way in limiting the possibility of any major insect or disease problems in a garden. Next, how do we go about monitoring insect problems as they arise? Both insect and disease problems are a whole lot easier to deal with if you catch them very early in their development. So when you go out in the garden, you want to think of yourself as being something of a bug detective. Of course, it helps to know exactly where to look for those bugs. Now, insect pests will invariably attack the newest and the youngest growth on a plant. Also, you'll almost always find them on the underside of the leaves rather than on top. So every time you go out in the garden, it's a real good habit to just automatically check under the tenderest leaves on the plant. Then you want to look down by the stem where the leaf connects to the stem. Those are the 2 places you're going to find problems. Now, some gardeners find it handy to carry a magnifying glass. It's a real handy tool for this detective work. Now, experienced gardeners know that you're not going to have 100 different insect pests attacking this garden at any one time. In fact, in most cases, you're going to have no more than 5 or 6 insects causing any serious damage to your garden throughout the whole season. Identifying just 5 or 6 insects isn't that difficult a task. In fact, what you need is a good book that has lots of color pictures of those pests that attack a vegetable garden. So then once you've identified the particular insect you have here, you can take the next BPM step and apply those techniques designed to control this particular beast. So that now we've identified a bad guy, what are we going to do about it? The first line of defense is to use what are called biological controls to stop your pests. Now, biological insect controls include a whole range of natural resources, including viruses, bacteria, predator or beneficial insects, and even songbirds. The principles of biological controls are very simple. The more beneficial predators that you have of insect pests in your garden, the fewer insect pests you have. First, let me talk about what I call micro-pals. In recent years, the gardening industry has developed a number of microbes that, when introduced into the yard or the garden, will attack specific insect pests. For example, this is a form of what's called Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT for short. It's a bacteria that comes in a white powder that you put on plants that are being attacked by worms or caterpillars. The BT, when ingested by the worm, disrupts its metabolism and kills the culprit. At the same time, it's harmless to other insects, animals, or man. Just remember, when you see that pretty little white butterfly fluttering around your cabbage patch, remember, it's the one that lays the eggs that produces that pretty little green worm that eats your cabbages. Fortunately, the BT kills that worm. You'll be hearing a lot more about new micropals coming along in the next couple of years. Virtually every one of the insect pests in your garden have more than a few insect predators just waiting to relieve your garden of pest damage. The prowess of the ladybug in devouring untold numbers of other insects, especially aphids, is generally well known. But the lacewings, dozens of varieties of parasitic wasps, and even predatory mites also account for their share of biological control of insect pests in the vegetable garden. Now you can buy beneficial insects through the mail order catalog. The only problem is keeping the hired guns in your own yard instead of their spreading over into the next neighborhood or into the following town. The trick is in how you release them. Now, for most beneficial insects, you're going to want to let them go sometime in the late spring, probably in May, before the pest insect becomes a problem. Best time in the day is in the late evening or the early morning when there's some dew on the ground, and hopefully it'll be kind of warm. Now, when you're releasing ladybugs, the thing you don't want to do is to throw them up into the air. What you want to do is very carefully open their container and lay them carefully onto the ground in the garden where you want to leave them, and even cover them with a little bit of straw. That will improve your chances of them hanging around. Lacewings come in the form of eggs, and they're mixed up with some rice. So we'll just simply take the rice and those eggs and very carefully spread them around in our garden. They'll turn into larvae, which are going to be voracious attackers of many of the pests in our garden, including mites and aphids and many other bad bugs. Trichogramma wasps are very, very small parasitic wasps. You could put 5 adult wasps on the head of a pin. They come in the mail in the form of eggs, and they're attached to a little piece of paper the size of a postage stamp. On that little piece of paper will be about 4,000 eggs. To release them, what you do is very carefully tack them to something that's near the surface of the soil in your garden, or maybe to the base of a tree right next to your garden. Those eggs will hatch, and those trichogramma wasps are going to attack other eggs of many, many pests in your garden. Another good tool for controlling pests is the ubiquitous songbird. A house wren can eliminate 800 to 1,000 insects each day during the 12 weeks it's feeding its young. An oriole has been seen eating over 100 caterpillars in less than an hour. The more birds that you have that consider your garden part of their territory, the fewer insect pests you're going to have, and the less time you're going to have to spend worrying about bugs. The way you increase your bird population is to increase their food supply, give them access to water, and give them shelter in the form of shrubs and birdhouses for cover and a place to reproduce. If the biological controls don't work, then we can go to something called physical controls. Those are things like traps or barriers. For example, I don't worry about birds becoming pests in my garden because I've learned a way to protect my vulnerable crops like berries from those birds using a bird netting as a barrier. Now, there are other kinds of barriers we can use to protect our plants from insects as well. An excellent barrier against pest insects is this new material called fleece. It was developed a few years ago to protect cool weather plants from the frost. But because it's so light and allows the air to go through, water to go through, and light to go through, it becomes almost a perfect barrier for plants against flying insects. It makes an excellent protection for things like squash, protecting them from the squash bug, or cucumbers from the cucumber beetle, or any other plant that's vulnerable to attack from a flying insect. The trick is to cover the plant when it's very small and young and let the plant grow up underneath the fleece. Then when the plant is full grown, you can take the fleece away because the plant's better able to protect itself from that attack. Now let's talk a little bit about traps. You can use traps to serve two purposes. You can use a trap as an early warning device to alert you to the arrival of a pest insect into your garden, and then use some other technique to try to control it. Or you can use a trap to catch as many of those insects as possible, and the trap itself becomes a control. In either case, a number of new traps have been developed in the last few years to deal with a number of insect pests that are real problems in the garden. Let's look at a few. Perhaps the most popular trap is the Japanese beetle bag. It's been around for a number of years. It works like this. You've got a lure of some kind up here that the Japanese beetle can smell. It's attracted to the lure. It lands on this smooth plastic and drops into the bag and dies. It's a very effective trap for controlling Japanese beetles. However, there's one important caution. Never place one of these bags closer than 30 or 40 feet from the crop you're trying to protect, like the raspberries or the roses. Now, there's another trap that's been developed to catch the codling moth, which attacks apple trees. Its design is slightly different. It does have a lure up on the inside like here, but the inside is coated with a very sticky material. So when the codling moth is attracted to the lure, it lands on the sticky material, is caught, and dies. Over here, we have a similar trap. It looks a little different, but it works the same way. There's a lure inside. The whole inside is coated with a sticky material. So when the insect flies in, it hits the material and is stuck. This particular trap is designed to catch the fly that lays the eggs for the corn earworm. So we'd hang this trap right in the middle of the corn patch. And there's a similar trap that catches that white butterfly that lays the eggs that become cabbage worms. Here we have a trap for whiteflies and aphids. It turns out that whiteflies and aphids just love the color yellow. So all you need is some sort of a stick or a board that's painted yellow and coated with some sticky material. And the whitefly lands on the trap, gets stuck, and dies. Now, all of these traps are going to work most effectively if they're placed in the garden just before you expect the insect pest to arrive. Now, that time is going to vary all around the country. So you'll need to check a good book or call your local county extension office to learn the emergent times for each of the insect pests in your neighborhood. Now let's talk about insecticidal soaps. Certain soaps have fatty acids in them that will kill insects by disrupting their metabolism. Now, we don't want to confuse these insecticidal soaps for those products that we use in the kitchen and the laundry. These insecticidal soaps make marvelous control devices in any vegetable garden. They're going to control aphids, whiteflies, mites, mealybugs, soft scale, earwigs, and grasshoppers. And possibly better than that, they're not going to harm honeybees, ladybugs, parasitic wasps, animals, songbirds, or us. Now, one thing to remember when you're using an insecticidal spray is that it only works on direct contact to the insect. So because you're going to use it as a foliar spray, you want to make sure you spray it on the underside of the leaves as well as on the top. Now we've tried the biological controls, we've used some physical controls like traps and barriers, and we've tried to use some soap sprays. Now if all those fail, then it's time to use the botanical poisons. While these dusts and sprays are very effective insect controls, because they don't discriminate between the pest insect and the beneficial insect, I recommend that you use botanical poisons only as a last resort to save the crop. These botanical poisons include pyrethrum, rotenone, and sabadilla. Pyrethrum is a contact insecticide used as a foliar spray that's effective against many pests, including leafhoppers, aphids, caterpillars, bugs, and various beetles. Rotenone is applied either as a powder or a foliar spray, but it doesn't have long staying power, so it needs to be reapplied fairly often. Sabadilla is one of the few controls effective against the cucumber beetle. You need a dusting tool to apply this dust properly. Disease can be a problem in the vegetable garden, especially in newly established gardens. And if a plant does get a disease, it's very difficult to effect a cure. Now, the BPM approach to disease control starts with that good garden hygiene, working on having that healthy soil, watering the garden only in the morning, and trying to use disease-resistant varieties of plants. Then if a plant does get a disease, a wilt or a rust or one of the fungus problems, my advice is to pull that plant and throw it away immediately into the trash. Then go back to your seed catalog and try to find a more disease-resistant variety of that particular plant for next year. That may sound like kind of an extreme approach, but for beginning gardeners, it's probably the best way. So there you have it, the backyard pest management system. It starts with trying to prevent problems from happening in the first place, but if one does occur, we try to take only those steps we need to solve that problem. We start with the biologicals, go to the physical controls, bring on the natural sprays, and if those all fail, use the botanical poisons. I think you'll find after a couple of years of using BPM that both your insect problems and your disease problems will begin to diminish. It's a very good system. Finally, a few tips on harvesting. There are some vegetables like pole beans, cucumbers, squash that need to be picked regularly through the entire season. For example, if you let a pole bean go to seed like this, the plant's going to stop producing blossoms and you're not going to get any more beans. So even if the fruit gets oversized, you want to pick it or you won't get any more vegetables from that plant. Now the rule for eggplants. You pick eggplants when they're a nice color purple and shiny. If you wait until they get dull, you've passed the harvest time. Now one trick with an overload of sweet corn is to pick it all when it's ready to go and husk it immediately. Store it tightly in a plastic bag in the refrigerator, and it'll last for a whole week and still taste just as sweet and good as the day you picked it. And the new super sweet varieties of corn will last for 2 weeks if they're treated that way. Finally, the rule of thumb for most vegetables is to pick them when they're young and small, like this, rather than waiting until they're mature or even oversized. They're going to be more tender, they're going to taste better, and very often they're going to be more nutritious. That should take care of how to raise some of the warm weather vegetables. I hope I've tempted you to think about using more vertical space in your garden for things like pole beans, cucumbers, even melons. It's a great way to increase the harvest and not take up much more space. We've talked about using organic mulch to cool the soil and keep those warm weather vegetables growing right through the heat of August. We've talked about how drip irrigation is one of the best ways to water a vegetable garden, and it takes the least amount of time. I hope I've convinced you that bugs don't have to be that devastating and overwhelming problem that they're reputed to be. Some real prevention steps, a few modest control steps, and you should be able to handle those few bugs that do show up and keep them from causing any serious harm. So keep the pole beans picked, keep the cucumbers picked, try to keep the zucchini from overwhelming the neighborhood, and you'll find that raising vegetables in the warmest part of the season can be both pleasurable and very productive.